Let's go ahead and get started this evening. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the third of our Global Shift Dialogue speaker series presentations. I'm Deirdre Mendez. I'm the director of the Center for Global Business at McCombs. And we are talking today about new directions in supply chain management. And we have two expert speakers on this topic today, and I'll start by giving you a very brief introduction for Mark Mirelez. Mark is the CEO of BEI Precision. He has worked extensively leading companies in the field of aerospace and defense. Mark has worked with companies in global, commercial, and military markets. So he has many years of experience with diverse types of supply chains and logistics. Mark, you want to say hello so everybody will know who you are?
Hey, hello, everybody.
Thank you. And Renee Vandezend is our second speaker. Renee is a serial entrepreneur, particularly in the medical devices field, and he is now a consultant. Renee spent many years advising companies in entering new markets, and he's also worked quite a lot with foreign governments. Most recently, he founded Emergo, which is a med tech company that was acquired by Underwriters Laboratory. So both of these, both of our speakers have a lot of experience with supply chains, and both of them have experience working in highly regulated industries. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating conversation. And to get things going, I'll just ask both of them, each of them, to describe a little bit the way that supply chains are structured in your industry, what the trends were before the pandemic that you were seeing, and how these have evolved since the pandemic. Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Deirdre. So really aerospace and defense in terms of how those typical supply chains are structured, you typically have larger OEMs like Airbus, Boeing, Lockheed that own the larger platforms. You know, those organizations, as big as they are not completely vertically integrated. They outsource some of that work for good reason. And so really that kind of necessitates a second tier and a third tier of supply chain and subcontract entities. And as you can imagine, on some of these larger aircraft, naval platforms, there's a lot of different components, hardware, electronics, software, sub-assemblies, take your pick. And so they're forced to source them typically all over the world, which creates a very large global supply chain. My group of companies that I run fit neatly into that second tier in terms of high-end, best-in-class hardware and electronics technology that services some of the larger OEMs. So the second piece.
Let's see, Renee, do you want to describe supply chains in medical devices, and then we'll go back to the remainder of that question.
Yeah, sure. So in medtech, that's how we're going to abbreviate it this evening. But medtech includes devices like Band-Aids to wheelchairs to hip implants. I always like to give a few examples because there are a lot of products that a lot of people are not aware of, that they are considered medical devices. And as you mentioned earlier, they are regulated depending on the type of risk associated with these devices. And something is implanted versus a Band-Aid on top of the skin has different risk and therefore different class risk, and therefore different requirements on how to comply. So that as a brief introduction. But the medtech, like so many other industries, also has the same phenomenon when it comes to supply chain and having overseas supply of components and all the way up to finished goods. So medtech industry is driven, I would say, for 75% by small to medium-sized companies, which do not all have obviously the in-house capabilities to manufacture. And therefore the outsourcing part of it is very common. So supply chain and supply chain management is critical, not only for the general operation of the company, but as well from a regulatory perspective, because it runs into a variety of compliance issues as well, as you can imagine. When you develop a device that is regulated, it needs to be approved before it can be placed on the market. So where are all the components coming from? Where is it manufactured? Who is manufacturing it? And I mentioned this already a little bit to some answers that we get later in this discussion when we look at supply chain and some of the consequences that happened as a result of COVID.
Okay, thank you. And can you speak a little bit to what was going on before COVID? What were some patterns that you were seeing, and what's changed since then?
Is that to me or to Mark?
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, so what I mentioned earlier, I would say over 90% of the devices manufactured or that are being sold in the US market by US companies are manufactured overseas, or have at least components that were supplied from overseas. So you can only imagine the consequence of a COVID where suddenly travel and trade comes to a hard stop. And the consequence of it. So an industry that has supply chains that are managed and overseas, then suddenly comes to a hard stop. So what are you going to do now? And I think what has changed, I think not much other than initial panic, a lot of revisiting of from an organizational point of view, what are we going to do next? So I think what has changed that there is an ongoing debate of what needs to be changed. And of course, there are always differences between the type of devices and how they are manufactured and how their supply chain works. There are always companies who, may take certain leadership in how to handle such a pandemic that impact their lives and their company overnight. So we'll get to that.
Okay, thank you. And Mark, what were you seeing and what happened? What has happened as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think before, it was a little status quo. There's the normal things that supply chains go after, big data, analytics, visibility of their supply chains was front and center and has been for several years. I think cost savings, strategic sourcing was important, how to pull cost out of their supply chains to impact the bottom line was at the top of everybody's list. And, for the most part, you had Lean Six Sigma efforts and planning and warehousing and transportation, all to try and streamline supply chains, make them more efficient and effective. Those are probably the top three on everybody's list and have been for several years. I think what I saw really quickly thereafter, including for our group of companies that we run, was a focus on supply assurance and reliability. Literally overnight, the questions were, help me understand sources of supply, what's our supplier risk profile, can you guarantee me supply assurance? And so, supply assurance and then risk profiles of those suppliers were probably top two in terms of, are those suppliers doing well? How much risk do we have in terms of them shutting down their manufacturing facilities? Are they highly leveraged? What type of capital do they have? All those were questions we were trying to answer very quickly versus, hey, let me lean out a manufacturing process. And then the one that stuck on both before and after, I think, was big data and analytics. It was one of the big ones before, and it's still one of the big ones afterwards. How do we get better visibility of our supply chain, real time, actionable, aggregated data that we can do something with in a timely fashion?
Okay, great.
Yeah,
thank you.
I would like just to add to it that both Mark's industry, aerospace, and my industry, medtech, are obviously regulated industries. And the questions that Mark just mentioned that are being asked as a result of COVID, you would expect that those questions were asked anyway, particularly in our industries, since regulations require that you manage your supply chain, right? That you take the risk out of supply chain. But I think to Mark's point, it is also evidence that you think it's being done, but obviously not well enough. So now you can only imagine what that means for industries which may be less regulated. And now obviously their impact has been as severe, but I think they were even way more behind the aerospace and the medtech industry, which in nature of the industry itself ask a lot of questions about supply chain and what if, and what type of risk do we run. So it's very interesting to see that even in industries like ours, those questions are being raised, and obviously there are a lot of voids, and now there maybe is an opportunity to correct some of this and do a better job at it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's a great start. So, Mark, where do you see supply chains in your industry recovering or continuing to have difficulty? What would you say is the basis of success for companies that are doing well? And do you think that the nature of competitiveness will shift at all as a result of this experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the companies that are doing really well are the ones that have taken this seriously, have the infrastructure, have set up tiger teams, some sort of special teams to really address the risk and have a focused effort on what does my risk profile look like? Let me Pareto my suppliers, single, sole sourced, and go after the ones that I think I may have challenges. And it's not just the normal challenge of supply assurance, but now you're looking at infrastructure of that organization. Can they pivot? Do they have the right tools, the right systems? Do they have the right capital? How leveraged are they? And so, I think the ones that are doing really well are the ones that have the teams, have the foresight to put the organizations together to ask the right questions. And then you've got to go act on it. So just because you have a cool team that says, look, here's the 13 suppliers that are sole source, we have to do something about it because they're in different geographies, that's great, but then you have to go work with that supply base to get results. And that's difficult. So then you ask, well, where are some supply chains faltering? I would tell you it's the ones that got off to a great start in March and April and maybe even May, put these teams together, got cadences going, but, got lulled to sleep a little bit in July, August, September, when the numbers started to come back down a little bit. I think they took their foot off the gas a bit. And now we wake up in early November and it's like, hey, where's that team? Where's my status? And what are we doing? What happened to those top 13 suppliers? So I think the best in class supply chains that have been out there for a long time have the right leadership and are doing the right things. I think everybody else that, was maybe trying to benchmark other best in class had good intentions, but, if they fell asleep a little bit, there are real impacts out there. I read one the other day. The Swedish defense firm Saab suffered a $130 million charge over impacts on their production of their Gripen aircraft because of COVID-19. So a $130 million charge, not to mention you now have a production gap in your Gripen aircraft that at some point, made sense. But now you've got COVID-19 impacts with your supply base that you've got to design in new parts, pick new suppliers, and there's long lead times associated with that. So I think, good leadership, good action items, some foresight in terms of how you go about the planning and execution to drive down those risk profiles is going to be important.
And keeping it going consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't take a break. You're not going to be able to take a break for the rest of the winter and into early spring. And you probably, to Renee's point earlier, we probably should have never taken a break. This was on everybody's list in terms of risk profiles of your supply base, but I guarantee it falls farther down in the priority list. It's number 13 or 14 on everybody's goals. It's not 1, 2, or 3 like cost savings or Lean Six Sigma or efficiencies are. But that's probably not the case anymore.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. Renee, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, it needed a pandemic, obviously. It looks like, or you know, a company on an individual basis runs into some challenges, then you see corrections happening as well. But this is a worldwide pandemic that has worldwide impact on almost any industry, any company that has a supply chain. So to Mark's point, I think leadership is very important. And I think it's also interesting, I think, for our audience. I think the pandemic was an opportunity for executive management to shine, to see who can step up when something like this occurs, and obviously those that may not have good leadership capabilities, and that all ran from, you know, just simple in the early days of how are you going to help your employees and their families and making sure that they're safe. How do you make sure as leadership that, you know, you don't create panic and staying calm and be optimistic? How you make sure, since there was not a lot of time to correct things, right? And the way communication suddenly happens within a business, it totally changes 180 degrees. Have to see how many degrees it was, but obviously the larger companies have communication tools where they cross borders, so there is a lot of this Zoom type of activity. But for many companies that was not the case, and it's on all levels, right? So the empowerment, leadership giving empowerment to their colleagues on the floor to make things happen. And I think it's those companies that have done overall well short term, but I also think for the long term has sets a certain mentality and culture in a company that I think is going to be very important to move forward. I think the digitization part of it, which we all know, we heard it already a long time before the pandemic, but now definitely as a result of the pandemic, a lot of companies do realize, obviously those that already had digitization strategy and projects and tools in place or in development, those companies will stay ahead. And those companies that were just thinking about it, now they realize that these tools are very critical. So I think that trend that already was there before the pandemic definitely got a big boost. So we'll see much more of that, where companies are trying to find ways and means from a digital perspective to see how they can manage the supply chain, inventory management, et cetera, you name it. Everything will be managed in a different manner as a result of this.
Thank you. All right. So another question. Both of you are in very highly regulated environments, and I'm curious what directions you're seeing as governments and companies respond to the downturn. Are regulatory bodies making new decisions? Obviously, we know, Renee, in medical devices, absolutely, there's been a tremendous change in the way regulation has been designed and also implemented during the pandemic. So I'm curious about what you're seeing there and what you predict for the future.
Yeah, so again, obviously from a regulatory perspective, there are clear roadmaps how you get devices to the market. And we're talking about devices, of course, everybody here in this call here has heard about the vaccines, because which is of course a drug, but as medical devices regulated. And I think we've seen on television kind of unfold. Of course, politics gets involved as well, but take that aside. I do think that industry and government, so the regulatory agencies, and when we look at the United States, we talk about the FDA, I think they've been working very closely together, and we'll have to see what the outcome of this will be, because I think if they are able, which it looks like they will, Pfizer is one example, right, with a highly success rate with their vaccine, and when they're able to distribute this and make it available to the larger audience, I think it's quite remarkable what they have done. So then the question is, what are the lessons learned from that initial cooperation, right? Partially the political pressure put upon them as well to move fast. And us in the industry, we know the challenges and the danger of moving, in this case, for example, a vaccine quickly through the process and maybe skip certain steps. It can have major negative ramifications that could be even worse than the remedy itself that it's trying to achieve. So, but I think the industry and the regulatory agencies stayed fairly disciplined. Again, despite the political pressure that was coming from the variety of angles that we all have seen every day on television. So I think the lessons learned from that will be very important to see, okay, what is the process? Are there ways where we can better or differently assess safety and efficacy? Which again is not a new debate. That was with artificial intelligence and the data available to us and how to assess it. We all know that there are a lot of new opportunities that will shortcut, I think, the road to new innovative devices and drugs getting to the market. So I think that is we haven't seen it yet, other than during the pandemic and vaccines related to the pandemic. But I do think that discussion will continue, and I suspect, and most likely will lead to different approval times, which I think is very interesting.
Thank you. So Mark, aerospace and defense is a little bit different, but what are you seeing in terms of regulatory reactions or any changes or relationships that are taking place?
Yeah, so I think that the United States government has done a couple things. They've taken a measured approach at helping. They've relaxed some requirements. Progress payments used to be at an 80% threshold. They've taken them to 90%, I think 95% for small businesses, to try and increase cash flow, federal paycheck protection. So there's some things they're doing for the industrial base at the second, third tier level that are having an impact and hopefully helping. I think they constantly look for other ways to preserve that second and third tier, who they know are sometimes highly leveraged and need additional cash. So they're constantly looking there. I think they're also looking out for their own interests, as they should be, in terms of things like repatriatization. So, there's a lot of discussion about, our supply base, how dependent are we on other countries and other organizations outside the US? And so there's a big push, not only by us, but by Europe also. The Japanese came out in an article that, said it's all about repatriatization. How can I get the best-in-class supply chain back in my country? We saw, I think, the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act passed a law that said it prohibited companies like ours from using Chinese telecom equipment. So that's a signal by them that says, we're serious about this. We think there's risk with our organizations, our supply chains, our industrial base. And so here's what we're going to do to aid people at making some of these decisions that are better decisions for the larger supply chain. So I think you'll see more of that. I think, again, it'll be very measured. It'll be timely. Hopefully help comes for the mid-tier suppliers in a timely fashion, and there won't be an onerous amount of regulations that come on top of that. But I think both of those verticals will continue to play out over the next 6 to 12 months.
That is so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think obviously in medtech, there are some immediate examples that we have seen as a result of the pandemic. When you look at the personal protective equipment, like the face mask and the gowns and the ventilators, as a result of COVID and part of the treatment. So the whole discussion around where products are being manufactured, of course, has kickstarted that as well, right? Particularly maybe critical type of devices like these products, right? There was 90% of these products, if not more, are manufactured outside the United States. So that's why we suddenly saw the shortages and the challenge that came along with it, and that triggered a debate to see, okay, we need to bring back more domestic manufacturing and not have them done overseas. So, and I think there are pros and cons to that, of course. Whether the industry is going to follow, unless it's going to be regulated, that there are going to be demanded by government that these type of products are manufactured here locally. But it's going to be a very interesting debate as well, to my earlier answer to the question. So we are live in a very global world, and are we suddenly going to bring back domestic manufacturing for most of these products? And to Mark's point, when you talk about efficiency and costs associated and bottom line, all these questions will definitely find its way back. And then I'm a little bit more skeptical. I'm also, with my accent, a person of the world, I always like to say, and like the global aspect of things, and we're so dependent, from a trade perspective. So that's just another aspect that I think is going to be very interesting. How far are some of these countries going to drive this kind of need for more domestic manufacturing? Is that going to lead maybe to other trade wars and all types of more political challenges and differences between countries or not? So something to be seen. But there's no question that I think that a lot of manufacturers here in the United States will definitely rethink their supply chain and the way they are manufacturing products and where is it coming from. There is no question about it that I don't think that is going to go away. It's just a matter of will it stick long enough for that it becomes an automatic part of doing business. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
It's still bottom line that drives things.
Super, thank you. So I had a couple of other questions, but we've gotten some really good ones that are coming in, and so rather than ask the ones I had thought of, let's open the floor up, and I'll just start reading questions that have come in. Actually, I think you've pretty much answered this question about, or addressed the question of repatriation. Are supply chains going to increasingly come home? And the question is, no one knows yet, but there's certainly, that discussion is ongoing. So thank you for that. And then there's another question, just in general. Is it possible that many companies may come out more efficient and effective on the other side of the pandemic? And so you've both spoken a little bit to this. Mark, would you say that, I mean, it sounds like your point was, well, it depends on if they keep their eye on the ball or they get complacent, right?
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine, an organization that is having to deal with a pandemic and a distraught supply chain and supply base, and coming out of this even better than when they went into it. Definitely possible. Leaderships can have paradigm shifts in how they approach their supply chain. They're going to have to look for additional funds to build infrastructure, build big data analytics, hire best and the brightest people out there, and then really have a focused effort on that supply chain. The one thing they've got going for them, if indeed they're coming out of this stronger, is that I think supply chain will get more attention now. 20 years ago, it didn't get a lot of attention. 10 years ago, it started to get some, 5, 6, 7 years. It's now, almost a C-suite necessity. And so I think this will bring it to the forefront. If it wasn't there, it certainly is now. And that'll give the right leadership the ability to say, I need X, Y, and Z, and here's what I can do with that. And here's why it's important to you from a product standpoint.
Yeah, I think also the digitization that I talked about earlier around supply chain management, I obviously got to push as well. So I think there will be a lot of products out there and tools that will become available, and maybe certain will become golden standard. So everybody will start using it. So I do think there will be a change in that area, that there will be better ways how to manage your supply chain because of this pandemic. More tools will become available. Of course, those companies that never thought of it and didn't survive the pandemic, of course, for them it's going to be hard to do. But a lot of newcomers and companies that did survive, they will benefit from the earlier leadership that existed among some of these companies that took the lead. So I do think it will be different and better.
Thank you. All right, Renee, here's a very quick, specific question for you. Was a substantial amount of money, substantial amount of money have to be spent on sanitization methods to meet the increased demand for certain medtech devices during the pandemic? given the potential for spread on surfaces of COVID?
Hard services, absolutely. Of course, hard services of now in general, but including hard service of medical devices, right? So those are regulated products in many ways. So yes, so that was already a requirement, but I think that has changed as well. Even if you look at your own personal situation, I'm going to Starbucks. It's hard for me to think to go to Starbucks without a mask anymore in the future. It's not a big deal for me. I know I'm not speaking for everybody, but yeah, the answer to that question is yes, which is in the end is not a bad thing, right? It's good. I think we're all going to be way more sensitive about bacteria,
Surfaces,
services, you name it. It's but definitely in the industry for sure.
Yeah, I think we've all had the experience of watching a movie of a party and thinking, no, that's not a good idea. What are those people doing, right? There are no masks, right? So
yeah, I think maybe the compulsive behavior will also increase.
All right, Mark, here's a question for you. How does the oligopoly or even duopoly nature of commercial aviation affect downstream suppliers during the pandemic? Does the lack of alternative customers for these suppliers present a specific challenge?
Yeah, so it is a very large challenge. Commercial aviation, has suffered some significant losses over the last, 6 to 9 months. Ever since it started. So you do see a ripple effect for that second and third tier supply base that, again, is super dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 different aircraft manufacturers, service providers, platform manufacturers. At whatever level you are, if you're heavily dependent on that commercial aviation industry, then my guess is that you've been impacted. And you probably can't pivot fast enough, is the tough spot is if, 50, 60, 70% of your revenue comes from one of these larger OEMs, it is really hard typically to pivot just to the government side of it and now support, a DoD program. If you have foresight and you thought about it and you had, a diverse revenue stream, then maybe, but I think the guys that are dependent on just that industry are really impacted now.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions about innovation, particularly in technology and how that might affect supply chains. So I'm going to try to put several of them together. One is, how have the revolutions in technology impacted the supply chain process as a whole? Are there any drawbacks? And then another question is, do you think smaller companies will start to rely on companies like Amazon and others with extensive supply chains versus building out and inventing their own, or investing in their own rather? And yeah, so I'll stop there and give you a chance to respond. Mark, do you have any observations about that?
Yeah, so the first question, look, I think technology's been huge in the last 20 plus years. Really data analytics, big data, aggregation of disparate systems has been at the forefront, probably top 3 things that, heads of supply chain have been after for years. And they have better tools now than they've ever had before. You can imagine if you've got, 3, 4, 5 different systems for some of these larger supply chains that you're pulling data from, that data aggregation has been hard for a long time. Now, within the last 5 to 10 years, you have better tools, you have dashboards, you have analytics, you're hiring the best and the brightest from schools like UT to go ahead and pull that data, analyze it, provide you, a decision-making tree to then go after and Pareto, what's important to you. And without that, you're really driving blindly. It's amazing how blind we were 20, 25 years ago in terms of demand, transportation routes, inefficiencies within the supply chain. So I think the winner has the best systems, the best digitization, the best analytics nowadays, and has the best group of individuals and talent that can analyze it and provide, a smart to-do list that fits into the strategy.
Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, no, just to Amazon was mentioned. Those obviously companies like Amazon are already very much involved in the medtech world, particularly at the end of the delivery side. So delivery, devices to their customers, right? Which is pretty common. And it took some time for companies like Amazon to learn more about medtech and the regulations around devices, components, warehousing, storing, etc. And they're well on their way. I've been involved the last 5 years with Amazon in advising in a variety of areas. So they've been in the classroom and are now way beyond. They have graduated already, and they will definitely have way more opportunities as a result of this pandemic. We all know that was good for their type of business, but it opened the door to help industry in many other ways, and it's already on its way, and that will continue to grow. So to that answer, yes.
All right, thank you. I think we've talked about types of innovation that are occurring. What are some examples of things companies have done to not only keep their business alive, but during the pandemic and help it prosper? Would you say that certain industries such as supply chain were built and ready for an event like this? Well, I think you've both pretty much said that no, we weren't exactly ready. Maybe you're never ready for a situation like this, but the question is, and the question at this point is, will that readiness, whatever readiness you achieve, will you be able to continue to maintain that moving forward? Do either of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say if you had the building blocks in place, if you had a really good supply chain organization that benchmarked consistently, had metrics, had data analytics, had great talent, then I think, and good leadership, then I think you're able to react and do smart things, because you've probably been doing pretty good things over the last several years. And with that good team, now they just get redirected, and it's no longer about, additional efficiencies and lean and Six Sigma and cost savings. You just redirect that talent to supply assurance and risk mitigation of the supply base.
Yeah, of course, we're in the midst of another spike again, and you already hear the warnings and requests of wearing our mask and everything else, because overloading the health system. So at this point, obviously, a lot of companies are not ready yet, and I think they're going to be challenged again. If not, it may be the last straw. If this spike will result into another lockdown, right? Which may happen. We do not know. So, but yeah, I think the longer term, things will definitely be different, and the companies that have the building blocks, as Mark said, will be placed. They will be much better prepared, and we will be much in general be much more able to handle a pandemic like this.
All right, thank you. So here's an interesting one. Brittany, thank you. During her internship, there was an unforeseen supply chain issue due to COVID-19, which was an aluminum can shortage that affected almost all areas of the business. Were there any strange or unforeseeable shortages in either of your industries that affected your businesses?
Yeah, so I'll go first. The typical ones that we saw early on from several companies were your smaller metal fabrication shops and suppliers that maybe didn't have multiple manufacturing facilities, were smaller in nature, under 100 million, maybe under 100 people, and limited resources, but provided niche tooling, niche fabrication that was, very important to the organization. But if they had a COVID-19 impact, if it was somebody on the assembly line, then you had to quarantine an entire assembly line, and that definitely impacted lead times, deliveries. And so I think that's the nature of the disruptions that we've been seeing, is the smaller suppliers that aren't, dual source, dual manufacturing facilities that have an impact on, direct impact on the line.
Yeah, I think for me, the usual suspects, the mask and the gowns, etc. We all, there was not enough inventory, and I'm not saying that as a critique, because again, the pandemic was very unusual and a first, and most likely with more to come. But so it just showed the weakness of the system a little bit, and how the supply chain has worked and where products are being manufactured. All the questions that have been raised earlier this evening. So, China, when you have most of these products, PPE, these are kind of commodity products. Vast majority is all manufactured overseas in Asia. Obviously, when you start closing the border, and these countries as well have been impacted by epidemics, and the same is happening in Europe, the same is happening in North America. A huge demand on these type of products. So it was extremely challenging, and the solution to it obviously is better inventory management. Again, the question about should we manufacture more here domestically, particularly for these type of products. So it's it. We'll see. We'll see how this. I'm sure there's some other products that may have impacted, that couldn't get raw materials or certain components. As I said, a lot of components come from overseas as well. So a lot of manufacturers here came to a shrieking halt in their manufacturing process, because the components were not there, and could not be supplied. So the usual challenges that have come to the surface as a result of this.
Thank you. Mark, you were talking about tiger teams. What kinds of strategies can these teams prepare and employ to prevent crisis impacts and address risk profiles? And how are they using technology?
Yeah, so there's nothing magical about these tiger teams or action teams. It really is, pulling the necessary data surrounding your supply base. Then you've got to go through the rigor of assessing that supply base, whether you've got 100 suppliers or 1,000 suppliers, and looking at the geography, looking at the types of components that they provide, and whether they're single source, dual source, tri-source. And then you're going to come up very quickly through analytics and data. You're going to come up with 10% of these, 15%, some number of them are going to be at risk. And so there's best-in-class risk profiles out there where you can look at, different characteristics in terms of geography, how leveraged they are, capital, infrastructure. Like I said, there's nothing magical to, a laundry list of what's important to you and how you rate these suppliers. What's magical is that you actually do something, that you go and address those 20%. And even if you're wrong on a couple, that's okay. You're going to learn a little bit more about your supply base, and maybe some are more robust than others. But, I think going through the process, and if you're a smaller supply chain and you don't know how to do that, I think you reach out to industry organizations, professional organizations that can help you in that case, and get a model for you so that you can act on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Renee, here's an interesting question along very different lines. So you were talking about how important the interpersonal connections are between management and the teams underneath them. And it seems that the power dynamic has been slightly neutralized through COVID in various environments, possibly including academia, because everyone's outside their comfort zone, including faculty. Have you noticed a change in that kind of dynamic in the discussions that you've been having and your professional interactions?
Yeah, so yes, when I talked about the leadership aspect, we see a discussion happening around just how to manage your workforce, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that a lot of industries or a lot of businesses, I think, have found out that working remotely, which among millennials is a very common thing to do and an expectation, but when you, maybe I cannot speak for you, Mark. I'm maybe an older guy here, but in my company, I always was very hesitant towards remote working. We had a lot of young talent, young people coming out of university, and I always like, that people who are new to a business and on a learning mode, to have them close to the fire. So in an environment where there are mentors around, and the physical or the face-to-face contact is still very important. I still think it's very important in certain cases, and on maybe not on an all the time basis, but I'm revisiting this in my mind, and when I talk to a lot of business leaders, people have companies, they are absolutely revisiting the way they're going to be structured. To my company, who was acquired by a larger company, Underwriters Laboratories, and there are definitely discussions that they are going to close down quite a few of their offices worldwide, and let people work from home, and have fewer offices with maybe smaller teams, executive teams, and that's how it's going to be structured. So I think we're going to see that in any industry, not just medtech. When you look at manufacturing, of course, you need to look at the roles of the people within a company, what can be done remotely and what requires, obviously, a facility to get things done. So, but absolutely that there's a lot of rethinking of how companies are structuring themselves to get the job done.
Super, thank you. And Mark, here's a very personal one for you. What is your favorite part about your job and why?
Yeah, I think it's finding ways to grow the company despite being in a pandemic. I think a lot of organizations are busy fighting the pandemic and looking at your supply chain and trying to keep pace, with maybe what the budget was and where you thought you should have been at the end of 2020 before all this. The challenge to me and what gets me up every morning is, how do you get past that? How do you get to that necessary norm, but then grow the organization in the middle of a pandemic? Because I think the individuals, the leadership talent, the teams that are able to figure that out, not only do, the baseline work, but then figure out how to grow in the middle of all this, will be the ones that come out stronger. And there's a balancing act to the millennials and that generation and how you manage them. I've had to adapt, just like Renee said. I was not a big fan of telecommuting or having anybody telecommute, but I've had to rethink all that. Instead of doing all hands sessions that I used to love to do, I now do virtual all hands. So it's a 10-minute quick speech about how the company's doing, because they still want to understand how the company's doing, and they don't care that they're at home and they don't come into work anymore. They want some level of communication. So we've all had to adapt quite a bit. I think the ones that are able to figure that out are the ones that are going to be great at the end of this.
Thank you. So both of you have talked about repatriation of supply chains, and this question keeps coming up, so I'm going to ask it. Is this something COVID is forcing, or was the trend already there, with many Western countries experiencing nationalistic backlash to globalization? So were you seeing this before?
Not in my world. The way I saw it, or see it, right? So the medtech world, the nature of the medtech world is like many other industries. If you want to grow your business, some companies strategically find that the domestic market is big enough. If you look here, if you're a US-based company, most of the companies that I deal with, they all have the ambition to grow and go beyond their domestic market. and like to go elsewhere. So I don't think that is going to change. We talked about the supply management and the risk management that you apply in your business. And when a pandemic like this unfolds, what you can do is one thing, but I don't think this is going to change the wish for businesses as part of their growth model is to export and be part of a global business environment. I hope so, because that's the only reason why I started my company a long time ago.
And Mark, I think your answer might be a little different.
Yeah, look, I think it's always been around aerospace and defense in terms of repatriation and, what are the key sub-assemblies? What are the key components? What's the key technology that we need to keep within the U.S.? And so, I think it's been important for decades. I think it's been turned up a little bit in terms of, what are we doing with certain suppliers in Asia. You now have a new cybersecurity requirement that just came out that all these suppliers are having to deal with to pass a CMMC certification that wasn't there a year ago, 2 years ago. And so, I think there will continue to be a focus. Is it only going to last as long as COVID lasts? Hopefully not. Hopefully we're able to protect our key technology and key pieces of hardware and software. But I definitely think it feels like there's a little more energy now than there has been before.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. If products need to be manufactured locally, how would industry find the resources and labor needed to move these operations in a cost-effective way? Is the removal of products from the company's line an option that you see for some companies in the industry?
What was that last question? Sorry, what was the last part?
So if reshoring is taking place, but some aspect of resources are not available locally, is the removal of products from the company's line an option that you see for some companies in the industry?
That can happen, yes. I think we've even seen it. That was part of the whole rethinking for a lot of device manufacturers. It's not uncommon that device manufacturers have many different types of SKUs, very many different type of devices, sourced differently, different supply chains, etc. And they have definitely been rethinking as a result of COVID what is still important to them, and refocus a little bit of what they're going to manufacture, sell, and overall control. So yeah, that's a good question. I think some companies have been definitely forced to do that, and as a result have come out stronger as a result.
Mark, do you have any comments there?
Yeah, so I definitely think it's possible in terms of repatriation and reshoring to bring some of that back. There are some skills, some technologies, some pieces of hardware and software that are dependent on certain processes, and so organizations in the U.S. have got to look at a little bit of what Renee said is, can I make money at that? What's my profitability level? How hard is it to bring it back? What infrastructure do I need? And all those decisions impact the bottom line. And so I think companies are making smart decisions in terms of, does it make sense or not? And that's really a little bit of the chicken and the egg is, do you bring it back? And at the point that you bring it back, does it make sense? And if not, do you outsource it? And where do you outsource it? And if you just go round and round, I think those decisions are hard. And that's why we haven't probably made as much progress as we would have liked.
Thank you. The aerospace industry, Mark, was hit hard by the pandemic, especially in commercial flights. Has this decreased the demand for planes and their components? And if it does, how do you make sure that critical component manufacturers stay in business for future production?
Yeah, that's a great question. So absolutely, it's decreased the demand, and I think it varies as to how hard different sectors have been hit, in terms of some of the large body aircraft or smaller bodied regional aircraft. Those demands are down for the most part in commercial aerospace. And so the supply bases that service those aircraft or build components for them have all been impacted also. So I think some of the larger OEMs are having to do exactly what we talked about earlier. They're having to relook their supply chain and say, who's critical? If I've got one supplier that makes an avionics component, how is that supply base doing? And do I need to do something to keep them in business? Because they could be potentially the only avionics company, out there that supports me. And once this thing picks back up, if they're not in business anymore, what am I going to do? I can't vertically integrate it. They probably made that decision years ago that wasn't smart for them. But if they lose that key supplier, they're going to be in a bit of a pickle. And so they've got to be going through that analysis now, because that second and third tier is more than likely hurting in some capacity.
I hope they continue to use good fastener companies.
Let's see. So here's an interesting question associated with sole sourcing and reshoring. Having production in multiple locations mitigates risk that comes with being a global company or industry. Do you think that countries switching to domestic suppliers and operations will expose them to more risk in this area? And will this risk be relevant in the long term? That's an interesting question.
Mm.
Comments on that one?
I think you need to have a healthy mix of both of them, right? From a risk mitigation perspective. Right? So, so the question, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, there's pros and cons to both sides, right? So you could have 4 or 5 manufacturing facilities that sell to different geographies. So it's easier to ship product, make product and ship product in the country that you're selling. But the reality is that there's somebody behind the scenes looking at what's the most cost efficient, cost effective way, which manufacturing facility is the best one, and how can you improve your EBITDA, and can I move it all there? But there is some risk, absolutely, in moving domestic manufacturing if you've got multiple domestic manufacturing to one location, and there is some benefit to it. So it's a balancing act, like Renee said. What's the right mix for you, your sales, per geography, your revenue split in terms of geography?
Okay, super. And Renee, here's one for you. How will the release of a COVID vaccine affect supply chain? What are some complications that come along with that?
Yeah, so on the vaccine side, so it's the whole current debate is we're already getting used to the idea that there is going to be a vaccine, right? We're very fast now. So, and now the next debate is, okay, how quickly do we get it in the hands of the health professionals so they can administer that to the people, us. So yeah, so that there are a lot of challenges around that. How to get it to people, when you look at it on a global basis, people have different geographies, how to get information, how to get the products. The whole question about the Pfizer product is that it needs to be stored at a certain temperature. So how is that being managed? And again, that can, depending on where you're going to ship it to, the duration of shipment, the type, the locations where it needs to go. So there are a lot of elements that come into play that you have to think about to get products from A to the end user. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but.
Well, we've been hearing a lot about the refrigeration issue and all of those other things. So there are going to be some
a lot of elements.
Challenges.
There's a lot that comes along with getting a vaccine like this to the end, to its end station. And a lot of people tends to forget that. What is so difficult about getting a vial, right, to a healthcare professional? So, but it takes a lot of organization. It takes certain supply chain capabilities, manpower, and obviously the overall delivery of it. So,
Well, we are actually
not an easy task.
Thank you. We are actually at the end of our time. There are a few more questions, and I have dozens more. But I think, in the interest of letting you get home and have your dinner, we should instead thank you for this fascinating conversation. We greatly appreciate it, and really are grateful for you for your sharing your expertise and your experience with us. So until February, which is the next dialogue in our series, we will sign off, and thank you all thank our speakers for joining us, and thank our audience for joining us as well.